All right, so jumping right into it, today we're going to take a deep dive into something pretty heavy, the Sylvia Likens case.
Yeah, this one's a tough one.
You guys wanted to know more about it, and honestly, it's one of those stories that really sticks with you.
It really does.
For this deep dive, we're using Wikipedia excerpts, by the way. Just want to make sure you know where we're getting all this information from.
Yeah, good idea to be transparent about that, always.
Definitely. 1965, Indianapolis, a 16-year-old girl named Sylvia Likens is brutally murdered. And when you dig into the details, it's a real look into some dark, dark parts of human nature. So fair warning, this is going to be a tough conversation.
Yeah, you're not kidding. And sadly, while what happened to Sylvia is extreme, it's not unique.
Yeah.
I think that's what makes it even more important to talk about, though. We can learn a lot from cases like this, about the complexities of abuse, about the cracks in our society that allow these things to happen.
Absolutely. And about our responsibility, all of us,
Yeah.
to protect kids, to speak up when something feels wrong.
100%. We'll get to that later, but
Yeah.
it's the core of it all for sure.
Okay, so Sylvia Likens, 16 years old. Her family, they were carnival workers. So already you're talking about a life that was probably pretty unstable.
Right. You're talking about a kid who probably didn't have a lot of consistency, a lot of stability, moving around all the time, different schools, different people. It's hard enough to be a teenager without all that added on top of it.
Yeah, exactly. And the sources, they kind of paint a picture of Sylvia's parents struggling to keep up, financially, sending Sylvia and her sister Jenny to stay with relatives a lot. It just makes you wonder what kind of safety net even existed for a kid like that.
Yeah, that's the thing, right? Was there even a safety net?
Yeah.
Or was Sylvia already kind of falling through the cracks even before this whole horrible situation began? And that's what makes her even more vulnerable to, well, to people who might want to exploit her, to take advantage.
And that brings us to Gertrude Beneseski.
Right. The woman who was supposed to be caring for Sylvia and Jenny. The woman who ended up, well,
Yeah. It's hard to even say her name, knowing what she did.
yeah, it is. But it's important to understand who she was, I think. I mean, no amount of understanding can ever excuse what happened, but
No, I get it. So Gertrude, divorced, 7 kids of her own, barely scraping by. The sources make it sound like she was totally overwhelmed even before 2 more kids got added to the mix.
and I think that context is important, not as an excuse, but as a way to analyze the whole situation. You have economic hardship, personal struggles, maybe lack of support systems.
All the ingredients for a recipe for disaster.
Exactly. And then you add in these 2 teenage girls and, well, you know the rest of the story.
It's crazy how something that started as a simple agreement, right? The Likens parents paying Gertrude to watch Sylvia and Jenny until they got back.
Which, by the way, totally normal thing back then. Parents working, needing someone to watch the kids. It wasn't like some shady back alley deal. It was just life.
Exactly. But then things changed. The sources say that their early weeks seemed okay, or at least there's no indication that anything was seriously wrong. But then,
The payments from the Likens parents, they started to become irregular, late, sometimes not at all. And you can imagine how that would stress Gertrude out, right? She was already struggling.
totally. I mean, I get stressed out when I overdraft at the grocery store.
Exactly. So you can only imagine what it was like for Gertrude. And that seems to be the turning point based on the sources. That's when the abuse starts.
The sources are clear about that. The missed payments, the escalating frustration, and then boom.
The abuse. And at first, it seems like it was directed at both girls, Sylvia and Jenny. Beatings with a paddle, verbal abuse, awful stuff.
But then, and this is where it gets really disturbing, Gertrude's cruelty really focuses in on Sylvia. And the why of that is a whole other rabbit hole. I mean, was it just about the money? Or was there something more going on there?
Yeah, that's the question, isn't it? Why Sylvia? There are theories, of course. Some people think maybe Gertrude was jealous of Sylvia. Her youth, her looks. Maybe Sylvia represented something that Gertrude felt like she'd missed out on in her own life.
Or maybe, and this is even darker, maybe Gertrude saw something of herself in Sylvia, something she hated, and so she took it out on her.
That's possible, too. I mean, abusers often choose their victims based on really specific vulnerabilities. So yeah, maybe it was something about Sylvia that triggered Gertrude, that reminded her of her own insecurities, her own pain. And that's where the real cruelty comes in, It's personal.
Yeah, and personal is an understatement. The things that Sylvia endured, it's almost impossible to even talk about.
I know, it's really hard to stomach. But we can't shy away from it. We have to understand the full extent of what happened.
You're right. So Sylvia was beaten, starved, humiliated, sexually abused. I mean, we're talking about a level of cruelty that is just unimaginable, and the details, they're so
The
disturbing.
sources describe Sylvia being forced to eat out of garbage cans, being accused of being promiscuous, which of course wasn't true, but it was a way for Gertrude to turn other people against her.
There was even this incident where Sylvia was forced to eat this hot dog. I think it was covered in mustard and spices. And then when she threw up, Gertrude made her eat her own vomit.
It's sickening. And then there's the fact that Gertrude involved her own kids in this. And not just her kids, but neighborhood kids, too. She would actually charge people admission to watch Sylvia being tortured. It's like something out of a horror movie.
How does that even happen? How do kids get pulled into something so twisted?
That's a really good question. And honestly, I think it speaks to the power of like group dynamics. You have this authority figure, Gertrude, who's setting the tone, who's normalizing this behavior. And then you have these kids, some of them probably vulnerable themselves, who are looking for acceptance, for belonging, so they get swept up in it. Plus, kids aren't always equipped to understand the full weight of their actions. They
No.
might not even realize how wrong what they're doing is.
It's like their moral compass is still developing.
Exactly. And in an environment like that, where the adults are setting a terrible example, where there's no one to step in and say, hey, this is wrong, well, it's a recipe for disaster. It's like a breeding ground for cruelty.
And as if the physical and sexual abuse wasn't enough, there was this whole psychological component too, right? I mean, Gertrude was manipulating Sylvia, isolating her, trying to break her spirit.
Absolutely. Control. It's all about control. Breaking someone down to the point where they don't even believe they deserve better.
There was this one incident that always gets to me. Gertrude gave Sylvia a knife, told her to fight back, knowing, of course, that Sylvia was way too terrified, way too weak to actually do anything.
Right. It was just another way to humiliate her, to make her feel powerless. And that kind of psychological torment, it can be just as damaging as physical abuse. It can leave scars that last a lifetime.
The impact on Sylvia was obvious. I mean, the sources talk about her becoming incontinent, being confined to the basement for days at a time. The violence just kept escalating.
And you can hear the despair in Sylvia's words to her sister Jenny. I mean, her spirit was broken.
But she still tried to fight back. She tried to escape. She tried to tell someone what was happening.
She did, but her weakened state, the fear, Gertrude's control, it all made it almost impossible for her to get away.
And those attempts to escape, they just led to more punishment, more abuse.
Yeah, that's when things took a turn for the worse, right? The abuse escalated even further. And there was this one particularly horrific detail that, well, it's hard to even talk about.
The branding.
The branding, yeah. Gertrude, she burned the words, "I'm a prostitute and proud of it," onto Sylvia's stomach with a hot needle.
And I can't even imagine the pain, both physical and emotional.
It was more than just pain. It was a deliberate act of dehumanization. Gertrude was trying to shame Sylvia, to strip away any last bit of self-worth she might have had left.
And then the events leading up to Sylvia's death, I mean, she was beaten so badly that she fell unconscious. And Gertrude, instead of getting her help, she forced Sylvia to write this letter, blaming everything on some local boys.
Trying to cover her tracks. Trying to save herself, even though Sylvia was dying. It's chilling to think about the level of manipulation, the complete lack of remorse.
But Sylvia's younger sister, Jenny, she was the one who finally told the truth. When the police arrived, she whispered to them what had really happened.
Think about the courage it took for Jenny to do that, after everything she'd been through, after witnessing all that horror.
She's a hero, as far as I'm concerned.
Absolutely. And her bravery is a reminder of how important it is to listen to kids, to believe them, because their voices can literally save lives.
And in this case, Jenny's voice is what finally exposed the truth, led to the arrests of Gertrude, some of her kids, and even some of the neighborhood boys who'd been involved. When they found Sylvia, it was clear just how bad things had been. The autopsy showed over 150 wounds on her body, signs of starvation, torture. It's just horrific.
The autopsy report is heartbreaking, but it's an important piece of evidence. It documents the extent of the abuse, the suffering that Sylvia endured. It's a testament to the brutality of what happened, and it's a stark reminder of why we need to fight against child abuse in all its forms.
The trials that followed were complex, for sure. I mean, the defense tried to argue that Gertrude was insane, that the others were just following her lead, that they were victims themselves.
Right, there's always an attempt to shift blame, to minimize responsibility.
But in the end, the jury saw through it. Gertrude was convicted of first-degree murder, which means, and I know we have some legal experts listening, so forgive me if I'm oversimplifying, but it basically means that the killing was premeditated, it It was intentional.
Exactly. And she was sentenced to life in prison. Paula, Gertrude's oldest daughter, she was convicted of second-degree murder, which means the killing wasn't planned but was still intentional.
And the others, including some of those neighborhood boys, they were convicted of manslaughter, meaning they caused Sylvia's death, but they didn't intend to kill her.
Right. So you see, there were varying degrees of culpability, different levels of intent.
And that's what makes these cases so complicated, right? Trying to figure out who's responsible, to what extent. But what's clear is that the legal system, it recognized that Gertrude was the mastermind behind this whole horrific situation.
Absolutely. She was the orchestrator of the abuse, the one who created the environment where this kind of cruelty could flourish. And she was held accountable, at least to some degree, by the law.
Gertrude was eventually released on parole, but she never really took responsibility for what she did. She died in 1990. And the other people involved, a lot of them just kind of faded away. Some of them changed their names, tried to rebuild their lives.
Which raises the question, right? What does justice even mean in a case like this? Is there ever truly closure? Can anyone involved in something so horrific ever truly move on?
It's hard to say. But I think that's something we need to grapple with, as a society. Because these aren't just legal questions, they're moral questions. They're questions about human nature, about forgiveness, about accountability.
Right. And they're questions that force us to confront some really uncomfortable truths about ourselves, about our capacity for both good and evil.
One thing that came out of this whole tragedy, though, was a change in the law. Sylvia's death led to mandatory reporting laws for child abuse and neglect in Indiana. So now, anyone who suspects that a child is being abused, they have a legal obligation to report it.
That's huge. I mean, it doesn't bring Sylvia back, but it's a step in the right direction.
Yeah.
It's about creating a safety net, so hopefully no other child will have to suffer in silence like she did.
And there's Sylvia's Child Advocacy Center in Lebanon, Indiana.
Right, a whole center dedicated to her memory, focused on preventing child abuse and helping kids who've been abused. It's a testament to the impact that Sylvia's story has had. Even in the face of such darkness, there's this ripple effect of, positive action.
For sure. It's like people are refusing to let her be forgotten, and they're turning that grief, that anger, into something productive, something that might actually prevent another tragedy like this from happening.
And it's not just in Indiana either. Sylvia's story has resonated all over the world. It's been the subject of books, documentaries, even a movie. It's clear that people are still captivated by it, and I think it's because it forces us to look at some really uncomfortable truths about ourselves, about our society.
Absolutely. And it makes you think about the role of bystanders, right? The people who knew or suspected but didn't do anything. What about those neighbors who heard Sylvia screaming, who saw the bruises?
Yeah, that's a really important question, because it wasn't just the people directly involved who played a role in this tragedy. It was the silence, the indifference, the inaction of those who could have maybe made a difference. And that's something we'll definitely dive into more deeply later in this deep dive.
Because understanding why people don't intervene, that's key to preventing future tragedies, right? If we can figure out what keeps people silent, then maybe we can figure out how to empower them to speak up, to act.
Exactly. And that's where it gets really interesting, because it's not just about blaming the bystanders. It's about understanding the psychology of inaction, the social forces that keep us from getting involved, and then figuring out how to overcome those barriers, how to create a culture where speaking up is the norm, not the exception. And that's where we'll pick up in part 2 of this deep dive. Yeah, it's a question that really makes you think, right? Why didn't anyone do anything? I mean, it's easy to judge from the outside, but when you're in that situation...
It's got to be so much harder, right? You're scared, you don't want to make things worse, you don't want to overstep.
Totally. And that's what makes bystander intervention so tricky, because it's not always clear-cut. There's this tension between wanting to help, wanting to protect a child, and not wanting to interfere in someone else's family,
And in a case like this, where the abuse was happening behind closed doors, I mean, it's even harder to know what to do, right? How do you even know for sure what's going on?
Right. And that's why education is so important. We need to be teaching people about the signs of abuse, not just the physical ones, but the emotional ones too. The isolation, the fear, the changes in behavior, because those are often the first red flags.
It's like learning a new language, right? The language of abuse. Once you understand the signs, you can't unsee them.
Yeah.
And that's what gives you the power to act.
I love that analogy, the language of abuse. It's so true. And the more people who understand that language, the more likely we are to catch those early warning signs.
So let's talk about those warning signs. What are some things that people should be looking out for?
Well, obviously, any signs of physical injury are a huge red flag. Bruises, cuts, burns. But you also want to pay attention to changes in behavior. Is the child withdrawn, anxious? Are they having trouble sleeping? Are they afraid to go home?
Those are all really important things to pay attention to. And I think it's also important to remember that abuse isn't always physical, right?
Oh, absolutely. Emotional abuse can be just as damaging as physical abuse, if not more so. Things like constant yelling, name-calling, threats, humiliation, all of that can have a devastating impact on a child's self-esteem.
So, say you see some of these warning signs. Say you have a gut feeling that something isn't right. What do you do? What's the next step?
That's where things can get tricky because we're often afraid to get involved, right? We don't want to overstep our boundaries. We don't want to make things worse. But here's the thing. It's better to err on the side of caution. If you have even the slightest suspicion that a child is being abused, you need to report it.
To who?
Well, there are a few different options. You can call the police, you can call Child Protective Services, or you can contact a local child advocacy organization.
Okay, so you make the report. What happens then?
Well, ideally, someone will investigate the situation. They'll talk to the child, they'll talk to the family, and they'll try to assess the level of risk. And if they determine that the child is in danger, they'll take steps to protect them. That might mean removing the child from the home, providing counseling, or working with the family to address the underlying issues.
But that's the ideal scenario, right? I mean, we know that the system isn't perfect. Sometimes reports fall through the cracks. Sometimes people don't take them seriously enough.
You're right. And that's why it's so important to be persistent. If you make a report and you don't feel like it's being taken seriously, keep pushing. Follow up with the authorities. Contact your local elected officials. Make some noise. Because kids like Sylvia, they don't have a voice. They need us to be their voice.
And I think that's a really important point because we often think about child abuse as something that happens over there to someone else's family. But the reality is it can happen anywhere. It can happen in your neighborhood. It can happen in your child's school. It can even happen in your own family.
Absolutely. And that's why awareness is so important. We need to be having these conversations. We need to be educating ourselves and our communities. We need to be creating a culture where child abuse is simply not tolerated.
Okay, so let's shift gears a bit and talk about the aftermath of the Sylvia Likens case. We know that Gertrude was convicted of first-degree murder, Paula was convicted of second-degree murder, and the others involved were convicted of manslaughter.
Right. And those convictions, those sentences, they were a form of justice, right? I mean, they held those people accountable for their actions.
But is that enough? I mean, can any legal punishment truly address the level of suffering that Sylvia endured? Can it bring her back? Can it erase the trauma that her family and her community experienced?
Those are really tough questions. And honestly, I don't think there are any easy answers. Because in a case like this, justice is more than just a legal concept. It's about healing. It's about acknowledging the harm that was done. It's about preventing it from happening again.
And it's about recognizing that these kinds of tragedies, they don't happen in a vacuum. I mean, we can't just focus on the individuals involved. We have to look at the societal context, too.
Exactly. We have to ask ourselves, what are the systemic factors that contributed to this? What are the cracks in our society that allowed this to happen? Because if we don't address those root causes, we're just going to keep seeing these tragedies repeat themselves.
So what are some of those systemic factors?
Well, poverty is a huge one. We know that child abuse is more common in families that are struggling financially. And that makes sense, right? When you're stressed about money, when you're worried about putting food on the table, it can lead to tension, to conflict, to violence.
So addressing poverty would be a huge step in the right direction. What else?
Mental health. We talked earlier about Gertrude's struggles with depression. That's another really important piece of the puzzle, because when people are struggling with mental health issues, they're less likely to be able to provide a stable, nurturing environment for their kids.
So access to mental health care, that's crucial.
Absolutely. And not just access to care, but reducing the stigma around mental illness. Because when people are afraid to seek help, when they're ashamed of their struggles, it just makes things worse.
I'd also imagine that access to quality childcare plays a role too, right? I mean, if parents can't afford childcare or if they don't have access to safe, reliable options, it puts a lot of stress on the family.
Absolutely. High-quality childcare, it's not just about babysitting. It's about providing kids with a safe, nurturing environment where they can learn and grow. And it's about giving parents the peace of mind, knowing that their kids are well cared for. It's an investment in the future, really. An investment in our kids and in our society.
It's like building a safety net. Addressing poverty, supporting mental health, ensuring access to quality childcare. All of these things, they work together to create a more stable, more supportive environment for families. And when families are strong, when kids are safe, well, that's when we see real progress. That's when we start to break the cycle of abuse.
It's hard to wrap your head around, like how could so many people know or at least suspect and just do nothing?
Right. It's almost easier to focus on Gertrude's cruelty, on the kids who participated. But there's this whole other layer of responsibility, or maybe lack of responsibility, that we haven't fully explored yet, and that's the bystanders.
Exactly. The neighbors, the people Gertrude talked to, anyone who might have had even an inkling
Yeah.
that something was wrong. And yeah, it's tempting to distance ourselves from that, to say, well, I would have done something. But honestly, how can we be sure? Human behavior, especially under pressure, it's complicated.
So, what are we talking about here? Why do people stay silent when they see something like this happening? Is it just fear?
Fear's a big part of it,
Yeah.
definitely. Fear of retaliation, fear of making things worse for the victim, even fear of not being believed. But it goes beyond that, too. There's this thing called diffusion of responsibility. Basically, the more people who witness something, the less likely any one person is to take action, because everyone assumes someone else will do it.
So, it's like a bystander effect, almost.
Kind of, yeah. And then you add in social pressure, you know, the whole mind your own business mentality, especially when it comes to family matters. We're taught not to interfere, to respect people's privacy. And abusers, they know that. They exploit those norms, those hesitations.
So, it's like even if you have a gut feeling that something's wrong, it's easier to just ignore it, to tell yourself it's not your problem.
Unfortunately, yeah. And that's what we have to change. We have to create a culture where speaking up is the default, where people feel empowered to intervene, even if it's uncomfortable, even if they're not sure.
So, how do we do that? How do we make it easier for people to be active bystanders?
Oh, first and foremost, education. We need to teach people about the signs of abuse, about the different forms it can take, and about the resources that are available. Because knowledge is power, right? The more you know, the more likely you are to recognize a dangerous situation and to know what to do.
So, we need to be having these conversations in our schools, in our communities, even within our own families.
Absolutely. And we need to be challenging those social norms that tell us to stay silent, to mind our own business. We need to be promoting a culture of intervention where speaking up is seen as a sign of strength, not weakness.
And it's not just about talking, right? It's about action. What are some concrete steps that people can take if they suspect that a child is being abused?
Well, the first step is to document what you've seen or heard. Write down dates, times, specific details, because that information can be really helpful if you do decide to make a report.
And then,
And then you have to make a decision. Do you feel comfortable confronting the abuser directly, or do you need to go to the authorities? And if you're not sure, that's okay. There are hotlines, websites, organizations you can contact for guidance. You don't have to figure this out alone.
it's like even if you're not sure what to do, just reaching out to someone, talking to an expert, that's a huge step. Because at least you're not ignoring it. You're not pretending it's not happening.
Exactly. And that's what we have to emphasize, that even small actions can make a difference. Even just making a phone call, reporting what you've seen, it could potentially save a child's life.
And that's what Sylvia's story teaches us, right? That silence can be deadly. That
Right.
we all have a responsibility to protect vulnerable children, even if it means stepping outside our comfort zones.
Absolutely. And while it's incredibly sad to think about what happened to Sylvia, I do think there's hope in the fact that her story has inspired so much change. The mandatory reporting laws, the child advocacy centers, the ongoing conversations about child abuse prevention. It's all part of her legacy.
And it's a legacy that we all have a responsibility to uphold. By educating ourselves, by speaking up, by supporting organizations that are working to protect children, we can help ensure that no child ever has to endure what Sylvia did.
Well said. And with that, I think we've covered a lot of ground today. This has been a tough, deep dive, for sure, but a really important one.
It has. And I want to thank all of you for listening, for engaging with this difficult topic. If you or someone you know needs help, please reach out. There are resources available, people who care, and hope for a better future.